Spotlight webinar with Syxsense. Today, we have our industry expert, Graham Brooks, here to give us an inside look into the future of vulnerability management. If you have any questions, please add them to the chat and Graham will reach out after to answer those. And with that, Graham Brooks.
Awesome. Thank you, Joe. All right. So today I have the pleasure of walking y'all through how you can use Syxsense to automate your security practice. Essentially, the idea is we're all looking for that defense in depth. We want to have a portfolio of tools that make sure that our environments don't look particularly attractive to threat actors. Something I'm not sure if everyone's aware of, but it needs to be said, is that most threat actors don't engage an organization based off of how much they want to attack that org. Usually, the engagement is started and then stopped very quickly because they look at an organization, they peruse their perimeter, and they say, this org doesn't have much that's open for us. So we're just going to move on. They do some port scanning. They don't see anything that they can touch on their web hosting servers. There's no simple SQL injection hacks they can do. And they just say, okay, there's not a lot here. Move on to the next organization. Because, yeah, they could invest time and money and energy and try to infiltrate that organization. But unless there's a lot of clout or they know there's a huge backing behind that org that they definitely want to take advantage of, it's just too much effort. So they'll look for low-hanging fruit because there is a lot of low-hanging fruit out there for them to attack. And if it's easy to enter, it's probably also easy to exfiltrate. So there's lots of ports open on the perimeter. They have bad password protection on their domain controllers. Usually an organization that fails in one area is likely going to be failing in a number of different aspects of their security practice. Syxsense helps customers and partners deal with that problem because we're not just a tool that enforces one small chunk of the cybersecurity discipline space, but we're actually a portfolio of tools that can help directly by mitigating vulnerabilities, but then also enforce other platforms. Like, for example, if you have a CrowdStrike or a Sentinel-1 in your environment, some sort of antivirus, or maybe you have a SIEM platform doing log management and alerting. All of these other tools that are part of your defense in depth portfolio that you need to have licensed on your devices. You need to have a micro agent installed for each of those tools. And you need to ensure that they're running, that they're collecting the data they're supposed to, and that everything is acting in concert with each other to provide that defense in depth. Syxsense is the backbone for that conversation, and I'll walk you through why in just a moment. Before we do, let's just take a step back and talk about architecture so we are all on the same page about how Syxsense works before we get into the details. We are a cloud-hosted agent-based solution. You'll install the Syxsense agent on each device that you want to manage, and once that's done, the agent will communicate up to the console with information. It's going to say, hey, I haven't been patched in 2 weeks, or I've got Google Chrome installed, but it's out of date, or I have a user that's an admin that isn't supposed to be. We'll collect all that telemetry. We'll then allow you to use our product to figure out what items need to be enforced today, what things might need to be scheduled out for a week, and what things aren't actually important for your organization. And then you can make decisions from there. So that's architecture. Let's walk through our defense in depth portfolio. And to do that, I'm going to head over to Cortex, which is our automation tool. We're going to create a simple but powerful automation portfolio that's going to hit all the things we talked about. So here, I'm going to hit create. We're going to create a new blank workspace. This right here is the editor for Cortex. You have your canvas here in the middle. You have a viewfinder in the bottom right, and then you have a list of actions. Any one of these actions can be used in concert with another action to create our automations, which can then be deployed at scale and give you orchestration. This workflow needs a name, and I'm going to call it defense in depth. All right. So the first part of a network security practice is the firewall. You want to make sure that your assets have a firewall. Some organizations are going to use essential firewall. Some are going to have it on a per device basis. We're going to assume right now that we're doing a lot of different things, and we're just going to focus on some key points so you can see how the tool would be used. So I'm going to say that we have on-device firewall policies. So we're going to create an action here that says we need to have a firewall installed on our devices, and it needs to be enabled. We're just using the built-in Windows firewall here. From there, you might have other requirements, like a particular set of ports that should be opened and maybe general restrictions on everything else. We're going to just, for the sake of brevity, assume that there's another policy in place that's responsible for those actions, and that just enforcing the enabled state is good enough for now. Once we have that firewall in place, the second layer of security that we want is insurance that the Syxsense agent is there, which we're doing already by having this firewall check, by being able to run workflows. We know the agent's there. After we have our agent installed, the third section is going to be your antivirus. Do we have SentinelOne, CrowdStrike? Do we have Trend Micro? Any of those awesome platforms installed doing their job? So I'm going to draw down to the bottom of the list here, and we're going to look at software. We do offer the ability to use pre-builts that are provided through Syxsense. You don't have to package them yourself. Most of your licensed software, though, is going to be packaged separately by someone on your team, just because you're going to need some additional flags as a post-provisioning process so that the software can be installed completely. For this example, I'm going to use that Falcon endpoint sensor from CrowdStrike. We're dragging that over to the middle here. And now we officially have defense in depth at a very small scale, a firewall and an AV agent. So we're starting that process. And then after we install our antivirus, we're going to make sure that our network VPN is provisioned. So all traffic needs to be passed through the firewall, and that traffic also needs to be encrypted. Oops, I dragged over the wrong item. Let's try that one more time. All right. So once we have AnyConnect VPN installed, we're then going to ensure that we have our SIEM platform. So there's a lot of tools in this space. There's going to be a different requirement based off of whether your organization has an on-prem environment or if you tend towards distributed contexts. I know that Splunk is a really popular platform, especially for organizations a little bit more traditional, a little bit more on-prem. Grafana has a fantastic tool. It's called Loki. It's a little bit better for some of those distributed environments. It's entirely up to you how you'd like to deploy it, what kind of tools you're going to use, but we're going to go with the Loki solution by Grafana. So I'm going to just drag over the installer for Grafana. Once we have that agent provisioned, we're then going to look at things beyond software. We want to make sure that Syxsense is participating in the process, ensuring that you have got config management under control, that you have patches up to date, and your devices are healthy and secure. And so we're going to move over and we're going to say perform a patch scan on this device. Actually, I'm going to get even more simplistic. Let's do a deployment too. So patch scan and deploy against this device. So drag that over. I'm going to tell it to look for everything and hit save. All right, so now we're looking at OS level patching. Do you have the latest and greatest out of band items? Are there Patch Tuesday updates that need to be installed? And then we're also evaluating everything else too. So Google Chrome, Java, Adobe Reader, all of those other standard use platforms. Are they installed, up to date, secure? Once we've done that, we're going to also look for config management. I mentioned at the beginning that you're going to want to evaluate your perimeter, make sure that those web hosts are running the latest version of maybe Apache, that they don't have a log4j vulnerability. We don't want to expose cross-site scripting hacks that could be manipulated by a threat actor to gain access to your environment. So security scan after we do a patch scan and deploy. And then here, I'm going to mark it just for critical items, so CVSS score of 8 or higher. And we have the beginnings of our workflow. This is just part of the conversation, obviously, but what we're looking at here is a simple defense in depth strategy. In recap, we're enabling a firewall. We're installing antivirus. We're configuring our VPN. We're configuring our SIEM platform agent. We're updating all software to the latest and greatest versions, and we're performing a vulnerability assessment at the end to make sure that all of the different aspects of a cybersecurity policy are in place. What's so beautiful about this is if you have a tool that's working in concert with other platforms, you get to appreciate a world where you're not getting invaded, whether it's on your perimeter or, God forbid, deeper into your environment by threat actors trying to exfiltrate your data, trying to use SSH keys to access resources that were never meant to be publicly accessible, because you're not attractive anymore. You have a strong perimeter, you've got a strong interior, and the most exposure that you're probably going to experience, unless you have something very attractive internal to your org, is someone doing a port scan, which you're always going to see that. If you've ever ran a honeypot, every org is going to be constantly bombarded with port scans at their perimeter looking for weaknesses. But as long as you have this full setup configured appropriately in your environment, you're not going to have to deal with much further than that. Obviously, there are other things that a platform in this space is not going to be able to deal with. For example, you're probably going to need some sort of email sandboxing. Everyone is familiar with your spear phishing attacks, where someone parades as a member of the executive team, sends an email to everyone on staff asking for credentials, and then they'll try to use hacked credentials to log into resources natively. That's where something like having Promtail collecting those logs, sending it back to Grafana Loki so that you can see, wow, we have a huge uptick in the C-suite accessing database servers. That's weird. We need to deal with that. All of the different elements of your defense in depth strategy need to work in concert with each other. And that's why having a tool like Syxsense is so awesome, because we can combine all those other products into a singular interface for review and management. All right, so how do I actually get this into my environment? What would that look like? For this example, I'm going to hit save and close so that we can publish this workflow. And then we're going to take a look at what we can do with it. So here, I'm going to type in defense in depth. And I might have to drop into one of my other environments real fast. Let's try this one more time. All right. And then once we get this loaded, I'm going to tell it to publish. When we publish a policy, what we're essentially doing is writing a configuration file down to the devices that are included in a list. And we're saying, hey, if you live in this environment, I want you to run this set list of actions on a particular cadence. You could always tell this to run a single time, and that would be helpful briefly, but configurations change all the time. Maybe you have a developer, and that developer is trying to troubleshoot an issue with a piece of software they're creating. They might temporarily remove their firewall. We've ensured that the firewall is enabled, but they turned it off. We want to have a tool in place that's going to enforce a firewall policy so that the moment they turn it off, it gets re-provisioned again. You're not going to be able to do that if you're only running it once. So I would probably tell it to run on an interval. The other thing you have to consider is if your interval is too aggressive, you might hurt CPU capacity. So if you're trying to constantly evaluate a set list of 1,000 or 5,000 items for vulnerability compliance or patching, and you're telling it to run this every 30 minutes, that can also be hard on your devices. For this particular example, since it's a little bit more complex, we're doing quite a few different things. I'm going to tell it to run maybe once every 12 hours. So once in the morning, maybe once at night, and we'll just make sure that the device is conforming to the standard. And if there's any drift, we will pull it back into normal compliance. All right, so there's our schedule once every 12 hours. And then we just have to choose a list of assets. In here, I'm going to go into my internal environment. I'm going to look at my Idaho location and say end users. So any devices that join this network will have this policy applied to them. If they leave the network, the policy will no longer be enforced. So for example, I might have one firewall policy or one VPN install that's relevant for my Moscow users, and then a completely different policy that's relevant for my Salt Lake City users. Whatever policy you need, you can craft it using the tools that we just described. So here, Idaho and Salt Lake both have their own enforcements, but it's going to talk back to the same generic policy at the end of the day. And 12 hours there, hit save. And then if I had all my settings configured correctly, which I'm betting I didn't, we would then be able to see it walk through the workflow. I'll need to go back at another time and figure out why. I'm betting it's something to do with my firewall and the type of devices I was targeting. Yeah, that's essentially how defense in depth works in our platform. That's how you can build automation around those principles. The one other thing I want to briefly walk through before we close for today is what it would look like to get reports around the work we've done. Because it's good to be able to know that you can create automation, but you also need to be able to validate it, make sure that the work's actually being accomplished successfully. There's a lot of different ways we can approach this. On a really basic level, I always have dashboarding. So I can see a list of devices, I can see patch health, configuration health, and their overall trust status, which that's a conversation for another day. We've actually done a couple of these spotlight webinars just around zero trust. So if that's interesting to you, please look at our archive. We have a bunch of content in that space. If this is a little bit too simplistic and you need to find a higher level of detail, we actually can pull full reports on your environments and show you what areas of non-compliance exist, and then show you statistically how that compliance has changed and shifted over time. This right here is looking at patch compliance only. So we're not looking at software compliance or configuration management, but Google Chrome, is it out of date? Adobe Reader, what's the problem? And it will show you month to month. If I go over to my security risk assessment here, this is looking at config management, and it's looking for particular trends. And you can see I don't have a lot of data here. It's just a couple business days, but I have a sharp increase in non-compliance over those 2-day periods. And scrolling down, I can see which environments specifically have more or less non-compliance. And then here at the bottom, I can see which items are most important to the organizational health. So as you're building your defense in depth using a tool like Syxsense, it's important to keep track and benchmark what your expectations are, because success needs to be measured or else you're not going to know what's happening. So you should take a snapshot at least once a month and say, our goal is to reduce our non-compliance against antivirus or against CIS level 1 by 25% each month. And you should be able to see a 25% improvement every month using our automation tools, using our reporting. All right, that's the primary content I had for today. If anyone has questions around the content that we have covered, please feel free to reach out to the Syxsense rep who invited you to this session, and they'd be happy to set up a session with myself or someone else on the solutions architecture team. And we'll jump on a call with you and walk through whatever scenarios you want to cover. The tool is extensive. We've just talked about defense in depth today. If remote monitoring and management is something you care about, or you want better asset tracking, or you're looking to upgrade your devices from Windows 10 to Windows 11, those are all relevant areas of interest for our platform. So feel free to reach out. We'd love to talk.